Global tensions are by most accounts at their highest since the Cold War. Conflicts in Europe, the Middle East and Asia risk escalating. So the big question is, are we heading towards a third world war? Welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un, and possibly Donald Trump. They're all leaders whose behaviour and endgames are very difficult to predict. So, what does their presence mean for future world security?
The Doomsday Clock. It's how scientists have been warning the world how close we are to nuclear Armageddon. The higher the risk, the closer to midnight the hands move. It's now at 90 seconds to midnight, the closest it's ever been. Many countries at the center of global conflict do have nuclear capabilities. Russia, for one, and the ongoing war in Ukraine.
They should understand that what they are doing now, trying to scare the whole world, it does risk conflict with nuclear weapons, which means the destruction of civilization. Don't they understand this, or what?
A clear warning to NATO members that the conflict could spill over into neighboring countries, given the right circumstances. Then there's the violence in the Middle East, with Israel, a nuclear power, retaliating for the attack by Hamas on October 7th.
So this is a dangerous moment in the Middle East. We will continue to work to avoid a wider conflict in the region. But we will take all necessary actions to defend the United States, our interests, and our people.
From the start, a big concern has been whether Iranian proxies like Hezbollah in Lebanon would be drawn in. So far, that hasn't happened. And then the growing tension in the Taiwan Strait over the reunification of the island with nuclear-powered China.
To uphold the One China policy, we should support China's peaceful reunification. If we want to maintain peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, we must resolutely oppose Taiwan independence, because Taiwan independence and stability in the Taiwan Strait are incompatible.
The United States has said it would defend Taiwan were it to be attacked. And all of this doesn't touch on the potential risks of AI or climate change, which both present existential risks. The picture might look bleak now, but does that mean we are inevitably heading towards the end of civilization, or not?
Well, let's bring in our guests. Colin Alexander is a senior lecturer in political communications at Nottingham Trent University. He joins us from Sheffield in the United Kingdom. Rishi Paul is a senior policy fellow at the European Leadership Network. That's a think tank. He joins us from London. And here with me in the studio is Martin Smith. He's a senior lecturer in defence and international affairs at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. Gentlemen, welcome to all of you. Rishi, I want to come to you first. The UK Defence Secretary Grant Shapps gave an interview recently where he said we're moving from a post-war world to a pre-war world. Didn't really get perhaps as much attention as you would expect for a very significant comment like that by a senior leader in British politics. What do you make of what Shapps was trying to get at?
I think, it's hard to discern exactly what he meant by that. The way I interpret it, and it's along the same lines as what Emmanuel Macron recently stated with sending French troops potentially into the Ukraine conflict, is he's trying not to rule out all possibilities. It's a demonstration of resolve that the UK does remain committed. But at the same time, it is slightly incendiary. It's an escalatory remark, so it isn't helpful in that sense. So it could be interpreted either way. The question is, how will President Putin interpret that?
Tell me, Colin, is there an element here of a politician saber rattling so that when the next budget comes along, in the UK it's just a matter of days away now, is there an element of putting this out there so that suddenly people start taking defence more seriously and your brief gets more cash?
Yes, partly. So I think that Grant Shapps is obviously, as Defence Secretary, has a lot of conversations with the military, and the military will be attempting to pressurise him into militaristic narratives, which will increase the spending power. However, I do also think that we must bear in mind that any war which happens must have an element of public backing in some way, and that in order to achieve that, this has to happen many years before the conflict occurs in order to sort of have a kind of ready public who is prepared to potentially make sacrifices, or indeed is sort of ready for potential losses, or indeed upheaval in their lives in some way. So this seems to me is just a sort of a beginning of the wheels turning in this perspective. Whether this actually leads to any kind of World War III or even any sort of major conflict at all for the UK is another matter.
Martin, it seems almost strange to ask the question, but are we on the brink of World War III? Everything we're seeing, lots of rogue states, conflict in various different places, and people have now got weapons that could quite literally wipe us off the face of this planet.
I don't think so, and the reason for that is, as you said in your last statement there, Enda, because unlike the previous two global conflicts, World War I and World War II, if you take those as our points of reference, one of the biggest differences in the international system now, of course, is the presence of nuclear weapons and the system of mutual nuclear deterrence amongst the otherwise antagonistic great powers that gives. So I think it's probably more accurate and perhaps useful to argue that we're entering into a new Cold War. As you say, what we're starting to see, as during the original Cold War between the mid-1940s and the late 1980s, is the upswing of proxy conflicts. So Ukraine is classically what we call a proxy conflict. You've got one of the great powers directly involved, of course, Russia, and you've got the other, the United States, organising a support effort for the Ukrainians, but not directly committed itself. Similarly, people are talking about the conflict in the Middle East, or the possibility of proxy conflicts there between Iran and the various groups that it is supporting and sponsoring, Hezbollah and the Houthis, and again, the United States primarily. So World War III, I think, is too apocalyptic and is not, therefore, a useful way of trying to sort of capture what's going on. But I do think there's significant evidence now that we're moving back into the kind of international the type of international conflict that we saw, particularly during the 1950s, from the Korean War through to the end of the 1980s and the Soviet Union's withdrawal from Afghanistan. Those two were both classical proxy conflicts.
Rishi, let's talk about Vladimir Putin. I see lots of cartoons online and discussion and commentary comparing his actions now to what Adolf Hitler did in the 1930s. Appeasement did not work with Hitler. I mean, are we looking at a situation where Putin just keeps going after more land in more places and sits there just waiting for an even bigger conflict?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a certain amount of truth in that. Vladimir Putin is a classic opportunist. If he sees an opportunity, he will go for it, like he did with the Crimea. Except with Ukraine, he underestimated the resolve of the Western states to form an alliance around Ukraine. And this has been to his detriment. The challenge is, and I think a better analogy actually is the proxy wars, is that unlike Afghanistan, this is slightly different in the sense that it's not quite the same, because unlike the 1980s, the Soviet regime was not under threat. I think Vladimir Putin feels this insecurity, and his regime could feel the pressure of this. And the volatile mix of nuclear weapons and insecurity creates a dangerous cocktail, which could lead to escalation. And yes, it is similar in the sense that it is based on aggrandizement, the same issues that are happening at the moment with Taiwan as well. It's not too dissimilar from that.
Colin, your thoughts on Putin's actions in the last decade or so?
Well, I mean, I also wanted to just discuss what both of my guests have just mentioned there. I think that one of the key areas is Taiwan, and Taiwan's an area that I've done quite a lot of research on. I think that given the Taiwan Relations Act in the United States, that should China engage in military conflict with Taiwan, that may well bring in a US-China angle to this, which then begins to spill into concepts of total warfare, I think. The other thing I wanted to say was nuclear weapons and this kind of nuclear peace theory concept, I think, I find that's rather worrying, because there is an element of confirmation bias here. Just because we didn't have a nuclear conflict in the Cold War doesn't mean that one is not possible. All weapons, I think, are meant to be used, and or have the potential to be used at least. So there's a worry there. I agree with what Rishi was saying. Vladimir Putin is an opportunist. I also don't think he really cares so much as to whether he loses or not. There's an element here of him wanting to be noticed and him enjoying the notoriety for its own sake, and the extent to which the Russian state thrives or is defeated or otherwise, well, still Putin will go down as a remarkable statesman, whether that's positive or negative.
Martin, just on that issue of Taiwan, are we looking in the wrong place here? I mean, a lot of the Western commentary is that, Putin has threatened to use nuclear weapons, whereas if China were to attack Taiwan or invade, that would inevitably lead to a massive conflict.
I think that is the challenge for the United States in particular, is it may find going forward over the next, by which I mean over the next 2, 3, 4 years, there's no prospect of the conflict in Ukraine ending anytime soon. As far as I can see. And at the same time, many analysts are now increasingly speculating about the possibility that Xi Jinping may feel strong enough to at least start probing, number one, Taiwan's defences, and number two, the resolve of the United States to actually make good on the commitment that Colin referred to there, and to come to its aid if indeed it was to be attacked militarily by China. So I don't think it's so much a question of looking in the wrong place. I think it's the United States in particular has to be trying to balance those two in real time, focusing on preserving its own core strategic interests in Europe, not least the preservation of NATO as a vibrant and significant defence alliance, the most important alliance it's got, whilst at the same time maintaining its own interests and, again, its own reputation for being a reliable ally and for being trustworthy and dependable in terms of the commitments that it's given in the face of what looks to be a deteriorating security situation in the Asia-Pacific.
Rishi, we live in a very worrying time. We see lots of countries who are spending huge amounts of money on their military. Here in the United Kingdom, they're not. The numbers are dwindling. The British Army is down to 76,000. I read a letter recently, an opinion piece by Tim Colins, the former SAS officer, and he said that Britain is defenseless. How worried should some governments be?
I think that's slightly overstated. I wouldn't quite agree with that assessment. So yes, it is true that defence expenditure has been dwindling significantly over the years. But the United States, the UK is very similar in the sense with the United States, is that we're both a nuclear weapon state. Our contribution to NATO is with our independent nuclear deterrent. So Britain does play a significant role in that part. We are part of the NATO alliance, so we provide that umbrella under Article 5. So the idea of troop deployments, yes, Britain cannot play that role in the world. It's just not possible, but we do make a contribution elsewhere. The problem is, of course, that an independent nuclear deterrent or nuclear weapons, their value lies in their deterrent effect, whether or not they are credible. obviously, engaging in a nuclear deterrence is a very risky proposition. It's dangerous. There's the problem of miscalculation, misunderstandings. Although Britain maintains a retaliatory capability, it's unlikely that Britain would ever be the one to go first in that sort of sense, using nuclear weapons. So it's purely a deterrent effect.
Martin, what does the general public think in the UK about the potential for a very significant conflict? Because there's an election coming in this country this year, and you've spent your life in defence, and you know full well when politicians go knocking on doorsteps looking for votes, people want to know about standard of living, cost of living, interest rates, mortgages, healthcare. Defence never gets a look in.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. So to answer your question, having said that, I think the public opinion isn't focused on the specifics of defence. These are the sorts of issues that we've been talking about today. Having said that, I think there's a clear sense, and opinion polls support this view, that the majority of people in the UK have a sense that the UK is one of the stronger military players in the world, point number one. Point number two, that is good, not just from the point of view of the UK being able to defend itself, its own territory, its own people, its own interest, but also to the extent that the UK plays a leading role, particularly in the European security environment, through NATO and through its wider global network of alliances as well. So I think going back to our first question, what was Grant Shapps really getting at when he talked about this idea of being in a pre-war mode, but that's what does that actually mean, and what's the political point behind that? I think what he was trying to do was to appeal to that general, perhaps usually unfocused, but nonetheless a real sense amongst the British population that we don't need to worry about defence actively most of the time, because actually, relatively speaking, the UK is pretty safe. And it's pretty safe because we are well defended, and we can debate troop numbers, we can debate equipment programmes, we can debate level of defence spending, but I think there's this bottom line sense that there's no need to actively worry on the part of the UK per se, because relatively speaking, the UK is still sufficiently strong and sufficiently well defended.
Well, Martin, let's take a look at this from YouGov. So this is their poll showing that most people in the UK are now braced for a World War III. An estimated 53% think it's likely there will be another World War in the next 5 to 10 years. A minority of 31% of Britons think another global conflict is unlikely within that time frame, and including just 8% who think it is not likely at all. I mean, the general public, Rishi, do you get the impression people don't pay much attention to defence matters and just keep going with their lives regardless?
I think they certainly do go on with their lives regardless, but I do think they are conscious of this. I mean, the war in Ukraine has certainly been brought to the attention of the public, and it is something that resonates with them deeply. This idea that a brutal dictator can just pursue aggrandizement over another sovereign state is something which I think connects with the British public. Britain endured World War II. We survived the bombings in Hitler. Britain does not want another Hitler. So I think it is something that resonates deeply. But I also think that I don't think that the concern of World War III is something that necessarily is at the forefront of the mind of the British public. I think nuclear use, it's a difficult one to gauge exactly. A full-scale nuclear exchange between countries, I don't think is likely, and it does not resonate as deeply with the public. But I think the idea of nuclear use, perhaps on some limited scale, is something which is of concern to the British public. I mean, in Ukraine, for example, this idea of Putin escalating with tactical nuclear weapons on a limited scale to escalate, to de-escalate. I think it is something that is of concern to the public, certainly in the conversations I've had with individuals. But I do believe that President Putin is deterred from using it in that sort of sense. But I do also feel that the public recognize that if you back him into a corner and regime change is something that he's concerned about, then it makes sense for Putin to consider this as an option. I mean, during the Cold War, nuclear weapons were designed to deter. Today, Putin thinks of nuclear weapons as instruments of warfare. That's where the challenge lies, and I think that's something that the British public do care about.
Colin, what's your take on countries like North Korea and Iran in this conversation? Where do they fit?
Well, both are what we generally call pariah states or are peripheral states. The question really is whether the United States feels it's in its interests to move forward with greater restrictions or control, or indeed perhaps even invasion of those states. In the case of North Korea, no, I would certainly say that North Korea is ultimately what we call a buffer state between China and US interests in South Korea, and also North Korea is nuclear armed and has that kind of element of what is known as madman theory to sort of compensate for any shortfalls that it has. In the case of Iran, I just get the sense that there are just too many delicate elements within the equation here for anything to, at the moment at least, to move on that one. However, that said, we've seen in the 50s and in the late 1970s revolution, turnovers of power, and US meddling in that area. So I guess that's kind of one that remains to be seen, shall we say.
Martin, just in summary, I mean, you would hope that people step back from the brink and that things kind of calm down a bit and we can see peace break out.
I think peace breaking out is possibly a little over-optimistic anytime soon, but perhaps more positively, stepping back from the brink. I don't worry as much as some people, I think, about the possibility of, just looking at the Ukraine context, the most immediate, obviously, security challenge in the European context, that either side is actually going to do anything that will tip over the brink to the extent of risking the use of nuclear weapons. Because I think if you look at the record so far on both sides, the point about deterrence, of course, is if deterrence is working, it's having a mutual impact. It's deterring both sides, not just one or the other. And I think if you look at the way that the Ukraine conflict has been managed and the self-limitations that Russia is imposing on what it's doing and how it's doing it, not seriously trying to interfere with the grain corridor in the Black Sea, for example, that Ukraine has opened up, because that would run the risk of potentially Russian missiles or Russian military action affecting one or more of the neighbouring NATO member states, as well as, and if you look, we talked about or alluded to Monsieur Macron's recent statement about the possibility of French troops in Ukraine not being off the table. But the very next sentence, he then went on to say, this is intentionally, what am I saying here? I'm not saying there's any plan to deploy French or any other NATO troops. This is contributing to what Monsieur Macron refers to as strategic ambiguity. It's sowing enough doubt, the intention is to sow enough doubt in the minds of Mr. Putin and his advisors as to not to risk it, is not to risk an escalation. So peace breaking out anytime soon, I'm afraid I don't see that. But the possibility of a serious escalation in or around or over Ukraine, I'm happy to say that I don't see that either.
Thanks, Martin. Rishi, final question to you. Just briefly, do you think the big risk is someone misinterpreting what someone else does?
Yes, I think that actually is a concern. And actually, I do believe that's where the crux of the issue lies. It's true that with deterrence, there is mutual deterrence, so both sides are deterred. But there is such a thing as inadvertent escalation, and that can manifest through miscalculation. So to put it into context, let's take in the Ukraine crisis. At the outbreak of the war, President Vladimir Putin raised the alert status Now, that was interpreted by the West and the US as possibly raising their defense contingency for command and control of nuclear weapons. So it was a form of nuclear signaling. And Biden did the right thing. He did nothing. He just acted like nothing has happened. But in doing so, he communicated a key fundamental of deterrence, which is assurance. In doing nothing, he was assuring Russia that the United States was not going to inadvertently escalate to the next level. And this is the problem with nuclear signaling. It's not just what's said, it's also what is not said. And maintaining this delicate balance between the two is incredibly difficult. Nuclear deterrence is a practice, is a very hard thing. It's in constant flux and it's changing. But also very quickly on another context, you could apply the same to India and Pakistan. They are two nuclear possessor states that actually have gone to war with each other. And through some form of miscalculation, they could make a mistake and it could tip over into a nuclear exchange. They're running what I call a hot hand fallacy. It's this idea that sooner or later something is going to go wrong because of statistical probability. So I think inadvertent escalation is something that is where the issue can lie.
Rishi, thank you. Colin and Martin as well. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. And if you like what you see, please do hit that subscribe button. But for now, from me and Brady and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.